All right. I'm going to skip over to British North America. British North America had consisted largely of 13 colonies, of which Georgia was one. The British had taken New Amsterdam from the Dutch, and therefore Britain controlled all the area along the eastern coast of North America, except for Quebec. Well, during the French and Indian War, during the French and Indian War, Great Britain took Canada from France. They took over Canada. Now, it seems like every big war that we have fought has been preceded by a smaller war. The French and Indian War prepared Americans for the Revolutionary War that was to come later. The Mexican War prepared us for the Civil War. The Spanish-American War warmed us up for World War I. World War I warmed us up for World War II. The Korean War warmed us up for the Vietnam War. And our present wars are not warming us up for a bigger war, but that could be the case. But anyway, the French and Indian War was called that because we, the colonies, fought the French. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War. Anyway, I will mention it a little bit later, but essentially all I want to remember about the French and Indian War right now was Americans and British fought side by side to help take Canada from France. Does this mean Americans and British got along? No. The British looked down on Americans and made fun of the Americans. And one famous song about that was Yankee Doodle, where the British wrote it making fun of the colonials' way of fighting. Yankee Doodle has some really anyway, I'll stop. Some of you might have heard more about it than I have, or that I'm willing to repeat. But essentially, the British made fun of the colonials, and the colonials resented. Also, a certain plot of ground that the colonials took and had a lot of people killed in the act of taking, the British gave back to the French. It wasn't Canada, but another island. And the colonials were very upset. All right, this takes us up to the American Revolution. The French and Indians were on one side. That's why it's called French and Indian War. Most of the Indians fought with the French. French and Indians on one side, and the Americans and the British were on the other side. I mean, it was part of the 7 Years' War in Europe, where France was on one side and Britain was on another. The 7 Years' War was won by the British and lost by the French, but among other consequences was the French lost Canada. Now, to this day, the people of Quebec, as part of the treaty that was signed in 1763, the people of Quebec still have been allowed to keep their French language. Most of them are Catholic because they were told they would not have to join a Protestant church or join the Church of England. That was part of the peace agreement. But Quebec voted as recently as 1995 to stay as part of Canada. So Quebec is still part of Canada, but they speak French still, and they keep a lot of the French customs. But Quebec was taken, and all of Canada was taken from the French as a result of the French and Indian War. Well, the war was over, and Great Britain found themselves deeply in debt. And also, Great Britain had to station troops to protect the American citizens from the Indian raids. And Great Britain said to the colonies, you should pay your share. And the colonies said, yes, we're willing to pay, but we'll collect taxes our own way. Now, if you read most history books, though, you might be told that the big issue that separated the British from the colonies was the issue of taxation. But if you look at the Declaration of Independence, taxation was actually one of the least important issues to Thomas Jefferson. He does mention that Article 17, he's imposed taxes on us without our consent. What were the issues? Well, there were several. Number one, the British were making searches and seizures into American homes without warrants. Another issue was the British were seizing Americans suspected of treason and sending them off to England for trial away from where their family and friends could help them. Because, I mean, after all, England was a 3-month journey by sailboat away, and only the very wealthy could afford it. But they would take Americans off to, and oftentimes even hang American citizens on British soil who were suspected or even proven of treason. And the Americans considered this unfair. And other things, the British were sending their own governors to be governors over our colonies, and America said, no, up until now we've always elected our governors. He was appointing judges, but I had a student do a paper that tried to prove that the real issue that separated Britain and the colonies was the issue of what constituted money. From the beginning, the colonials did not have very much silver and gold. In Europe, only silver and gold coins were considered money. Well, there wasn't much silver and gold coins in the colonies, so the colonies began issuing banknotes. Basically, the colonies began issuing paper money. IOUs, banknotes, governments would issue paper money. And the British, when they imposed taxes, they said, no, these taxes must be paid for in silver coins. And the colonies, we don't have silver coins here. And the colonials realized if they were not allowed to use their IOUs and their banknotes and their paper money, that they would simply become totally impoverished because there just wasn't enough silver and gold to go around. And the British were trying to stop us from using paper. Again, this might be some new idea to some of you, but taxation was just one issue. Now, it is true the British passed an act called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act required the stamps be paid in gold and silver coins, basically silver coins. And the colonials simply refused to pay it. The British tried to impose other taxes on the colonies, and again insisted that they could not accept colonial paper money. And again, the colonies refused to pay the tax. The tensions got so high that finally the colonists met in the Continental Congresses, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and eventually wrote a document called the Declaration of Independence, where they declared their independence from Britain. Now, folks, the war lasted 6 years. And if you study American history, you devote a whole class period, one whole chapter to the Revolutionary War. The war is called the Revolutionary War. And if you take American history, again, you'll spend a whole chapter discussing it. I must mention two names, though. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and of course the military leader, whom I can't leave out, George Washington, a farmer by trade. Well, both of these men were farmers by profession. Washington led the colonial army. But anyway, I'm going to make a long story short. The colonists should have lost. There seemed to be no way they could take on Great Britain. But several good fortune events occurred to colonists. Number one, Spain all of a sudden declared war on Great Britain. Then Russia and Holland threatened to fight Britain also, and Britain said they couldn't afford that. Then, if that weren't enough, France decided, because France had just been defeated half a generation before and lost some of their territory, France decided to help us out. So, with help from the French, and with a good fortune, I mean, Spain would not help us, but there's an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Spain would not side with it because Spain felt like that that the colonies had their eyes set on Florida and New Mexico, and they would eventually take over Florida and New Mexico, which the Americans eventually did. But nevertheless, Spain fought a war. So Great Britain found itself fighting a war with France, with the colonies, with Spain, and a war threatened with Holland and Russia. When one of their generals, British General Cornwallis, came home in defeat, most of the British had said, we've had enough. We just can't keep fighting this war, and they signed a paper giving the Americans their independence. The treaty was called the Treaty of Paris. Anyway, make a long story short, the Revolutionary War ended with a British defeat and the British losing 13 of their North American colonies. Canada refused to join. The West Indies Islands refused to join also, but the 13 colonies that joined became independent. Then the United States formed a new nation. They set up a Bill of Rights, so set up a Constitution with a Bill of Rights. All right, and at this point I always have to say this, folks. In the Bill of Rights, there's a right to guarantee free speech. Please be extremely careful how you exercise the right of free speech. There is no free speech in this world. Your speech will determine whether you get a job or whether you keep a job if you get one. Your speech determines whether you have any friends or whether you can keep them. Your speech will even determine whether you can get married or whether you can stay married once you get married. Your speech, it determines whether you get elected or whether you don't. Just ask any politician. You have to be able to say as much as possible what the people around you want to hear. Or if you can't say what you know they want to hear, you have to be careful how you disagree with them. But the Bill of Rights, among other things, guarantees free speech. Again, if you took American history, you would study it in a lot more depth. Study the Bill of Rights in a lot more depth, but we're going to move on. In effect, yes, I must be a Constitution. The new nation was set up, and it was known as the United States of America, and it has lasted from that day to this. And it went on, your book doesn't say so here, but to become possibly the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Okay, got this. Anybody have any questions?